We continue to monitor the situation closely.
And we urge everyone to remain calm during this time.
A federal judge thought she could silence Jasmine Crockett. What she didn't know, Jasmine was about to rewrite the rules of the courtroom itself. The chamber was still when the judge's gavel struck, a sharp crack that seemed to cut through the air. It wasn't just wood against wood, it was authority demanding obedience. Eyes darted across the room, shoulders stiffened, and in that instant, silence became a weapon. Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her presence heavy, the weight of the system wrapped around every syllable she spoke. She believed this moment belonged to her. She believed the congresswoman seated before her, younger, bolder, unafraid, would bend under the weight of judicial scorn. The command was meant to humiliate, to cage Jasmine's fire behind cold formality. Punishment delivered not through chains, but through intimidation. But Jasmine Crockett was not built to flinch. She sat steady, her breath measured, her eyes locked on Howell with a quiet that did not concede. The chamber might have frozen, but inside Jasmine's mind, the fire was alive. Every condescending glance, every underestimation she had endured had led to this exact confrontation. The gavel came down, but the silence didn't last. What followed was not chaos, but clarity, a ripple of tension that thickened the air. Howell wanted obedience. Jasmine offered brilliance. There was a calmness in her defiance, the kind that unnerves those who mistake quiet for weakness. Her expression didn't break, but her very stillness was a message. You don't own the rules here. You only think you do. The audience in the gallery felt it too. Phones tightened in palms, whispers buzzed at the edges. The spectacle wasn't simply a hearing, it was a duel dressed in formality, arrogance colliding with intellect. One held power granted by the bench. The other carried something rarer, the sharp edge of knowledge no gavel could suppress. Judge Howell tried to cage her with procedure, but Jasmine Crockett was already crafting an escape made not of rebellion but of law itself. So how did a young congresswoman outsmart a federal judge? In Washington, power doesn't just live in laws or votes. It breathes in the rooms where voices are silenced, where authority doesn't need to shout because its weight alone bends the air. And few carried that weight like Judge Beryl Howell. Her reputation stretched beyond the marble pillars of the courthouse. She was known for her iron hand, for rulings delivered with an edge that made lawyers flinch before they even spoke. They called it intimidation from the bench. A legacy carved not in fairness but in fear. To many, she was the guardian of order. To others, she was its enforcer, a reminder that in her court, hesitation was weakness and defiance was punished. For years, Howell thrived in that aura, a figure cloaked in black robes and unchallenged command. She believed she represented the system at its sternest, the kind of authority that never had to explain itself. But authority, no matter how ironclad, is fragile when it collides with someone who refuses to play the role of the intimidated. Enter Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman forged not in polished chambers but in the grit of confrontation. She was young, outspoken, and unapologetically sharp. The media mocked her for being too bold, too direct, the kind of lawmaker who didn't soften her words to earn approval. Critics dismissed her as reckless, a performer chasing sound bites. But what they missed was the precision beneath her fire, the legal mind that had sharpened itself long before the cameras ever turned her way. For Jasmine, boldness wasn't theater. It was survival. Every sneer, every underestimation, every headline mocking her cadence only fueled her resolve. She knew the world was watching her through a distorted lens, but she also knew that in the arena of truth, distortion never lasts. And so when Judge Howell tried to wield silence as a weapon, it wasn't merely a personal clash. It was the embodiment of something larger, something the audience could feel in their bones. It was the battle between systems built to control and individuals born to resist. The stakes were far greater than pride. They were about free speech in the face of suppression, dignity standing against condescension, and the eternal duel between authority and truth. Every word spoken in that chamber carried echoes outside its walls, into headlines, into living rooms, into the very fabric of a political culture teetering between obedience and rebellion. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just represent herself. In her refusal to bow, she carried the frustration of millions who had been told to wait their turn, to lower their voice, to accept less than fairness. And Howell, she represented the system that demanded those silences. The clash mattered because it was never only about a gavel striking wood. It was about whether that sound would echo as a command to obey or as a call to resist. Judge Howell thought she was defending order. Jasmine Crockett was defending something older, deeper, the right to speak truth even when power wants quiet. Their collision wasn't random. It was inevitable. Judge Beryl Howell's career was built on fear and respect. though the line between the two was always blurred. In Washington's legal circles, her name carried weight like a hammer. Attorneys whispered her reputation before stepping into her courtroom, precise, unsparing, and merciless toward those who dared to stumble. To many, she was a protector of order, a figure who demanded sharpness and punished weakness. But order enforced with iron often breeds its opposite. Howell's courtroom, meant to symbolize stability, frequently became a stage for resentment. Lawyers left shaken not just by rulings but by the sting of humiliation. Witnesses described her gavel as more than a tool. It was a weapon, one that struck not only the bench but the dignity of anyone who challenged her. And yet, beneath the facade of control, cracks began to show. Critics murmured that her heavy hand sometimes turned simple hearings into spectacles. What she framed as discipline often spiraled into tension. Instead of quiet command, her style invited resistance. The harder she pressed for silence, the louder the echoes of defiance became. Still, Howell carried herself as if untouchable. Years on the bench had taught her to believe her authority was unshakable, her word final. She mistook fear for loyalty and silence for respect. But authority resting on intimidation is more fragile than it appears. And this time, she picked the wrong opponent. Jasmine Crockett had grown used to being underestimated. Reporters clipped her speeches into sound bites, stripping away substance to mock her tone. Headlines painted her as fiery but unfocused, bold but unrefined. On late-night panels, pundits smirked at her cadence, reducing years of legal expertise to caricature. But Jasmine understood what they didn't. The bluntness they ridiculed was not a flaw. It was armor. Every sharp word, every direct challenge was born of battles waged long before she ever entered Congress. To her critics, she was too loud, too raw, too unapologetic. To those who truly listened, she was precise, deliberate, and relentless. She wasn't just fighting a judge. She was fighting every stereotype ever thrown at her, every smirk about too much attitude, every dismissal of her intellect, every attempt to box her into a role she refused to play. In that courtroom, she wasn't only defending her voice. She was defending the credibility of an entire movement that believed honesty should never be muted to please power. For Jasmine, the stakes were never limited to her own reputation. If she faltered, the narrative would not frame it as one woman's stumble. It would be cast as proof that her entire generation of bold, outspoken leaders lacked discipline, lacked seriousness, lacked worth. And so, when Judge Howell tried to turn punishment into spectacle, Jasmine knew the moment was bigger than a single clash. The gavel's strike wasn't just a command to her. It was a challenge to everyone she represented. And Howell's punishment attempt was the final spark. The confrontation sharpened with every strike of the gavel. Judge Howell leaned forward, wielding her authority like a blade, and for a time, it appeared Jasmine Crockett had been cornered. The chamber tilted toward Howell's command. Reporters scribbled notes, eager to craft headlines of a congresswoman scolded, diminished, put in her place by the black, robed power of the court. At first, Jasmine felt the weight pressing down. Howell cut her off mid-sentence, each interruption striking not only her words but her dignity. The congresswoman's frustration simmered, yet in that moment she could not push back without risking contempt. Silence was forced upon her, and the optics seemed damning. A young lawmaker, silenced by a judge, the perfect image for those waiting to mock her. Outside the chamber, the spin machine roared to life. Commentators framed the moment as arrogance undone, as if Jasmine's defiance had finally met its superior. Clips looped across screens with captions designed to belittle, too bold for her own good. Courtroom reality check. Online voices piled on, jeering at her composure, turning her stillness into a symbol of defeat. The humiliation cut deep because Jasmine knew the sting of perception was sometimes sharper than reality. The truth of what had happened. Howell's overreach, her heavy-handed silencing, risked being buried under the avalanche of narrative. For every ally who saw the injustice, 10 critics spun it as proof that Jasmine was reckless, unfit, unprepared. This was gaslighting at its finest. Howell's display of authority, meant to crush dissent, was reframed by loyal voices as discipline, as justice. And Jasmine's quiet resistance was spun as weakness, a woman overwhelmed, a politician unable to handle the sharp edge of power. The more she was underestimated, the more the system seemed determined to paint her defiance as incompetence. The reversals came quickly. Howell doubled down, issuing sharp reminders that decorum must be maintained. Her tone carried the weight of inevitability, as if no one could question her judgment. The chamber watched, half in fear, half in fascination, as she attempted to box Jasmine into silence. And yet, amid the humiliation, Jasmine's mind was working. She recognized the trap, a temporary loss of voice being used to frame her entire presence as illegitimate. Howell had gained control of the room, but it was a fragile dominance. dependent not on justice, but on intimidation and spectacle. Jasmine felt the sting, yes. She tasted the bitterness of being misrepresented, manipulated, and mocked. But she also knew something Howell had yet to realize. Silence can be temporary, and humiliation, if endured with discipline, can become the seed of reversal. Still, the pressure was suffocating. Allies sent worried glances, afraid she had been cut too deeply. Enemies smirked, satisfied that her fire had been snuffed out. Cameras zoomed in, capturing her calm exterior, while the narrative outside grew crueler by the second. The tension was unbearable, the imbalance sharp. Howell stood triumphant in her own court, convinced she had reduced Jasmine to a cautionary tale. The moment seemed sealed. Judge victorious, Congresswoman chastised. But authority built on arrogance always leaves cracks. And in Howell's heavy hand, those cracks widened. The chamber didn't see it yet, the cameras hadn't caught it. But Jasmine did. She was waiting, gathering, sharpening. The world thought they had watched her collapse under pressure. What they didn't know was that she was preparing the reversal, that her silence was not surrender but calculation. Her eyes stayed fixed on Howell, calm, steady, unbroken. Beneath that quiet exterior was the storm she had chosen not to unleash. Yet, the chamber had written the ending too soon, and the pundits had declared the verdict too quickly. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She hadn't even begun. But then, the script flipped. The chamber had nearly settled into the illusion of Howell's victory when the first crack in her authority appeared. It didn't thunder. It whispered. A slip, almost invisible, was tucked inside the rhythm of her command, but Jasmine heard it. She had trained her ear for years to catch the difference between law and performance, between justice and intimidation. Howell, so determined to enforce silence, overreached. In her zeal to put Jasmine in her place, she cited precedent, a case she framed as unshakable proof of her authority. The words fell heavy, and most in the room accepted them as gospel. But Jasmine recognized the flaw instantly. The precedent Howell leaned on had been limited, narrowed by later rulings. To invoke it without context was not a strength, it was weakness disguised as authority. The irony was almost unbearable. Howell, the judge famed for her mastery of order, had just betrayed the very principle she claimed to defend. In her attempt to cage Jasmine, she had revealed ignorance, or worse, arrogance. So great it risked collapsing her own argument. At first, Jasmine felt the crushing weight of betrayal herself. The betrayal wasn't personal but systemic, a reminder of how often those in robes twisted law into performance, wielding it as a weapon instead of a shield. The bitterness burned in her chest. For a heartbeat, she thought the room would swallow her whole, that the narrative of defeat was unbreakable. But then the fire steadied. If Howell had opened a crack, Jasmine could widen it. She began to gather her leverage, not with raised voice or wild gesture, but with the precision of a surgeon. She waited, allowing Howell to continue, allowing arrogance to build the stage for its own collapse. The first reversal came with a question, measured, surgical. Jasmine referenced the very precedent Howell had invoked, calmly pointing to its later limitation. The chamber stirred, a few heads tilted. Howell stiffened, her authority challenged not with rebellion but with the quiet weight of truth. Howell tried to wave it off, to reassert her dominance with tone rather than fact. But Jasmine pressed again, this time citing a second case, one that directly undermined the judge's framing. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't chaos. It was brilliance unfolding with the inevitability of gravity. The audience felt the shift. A ripple of disbelief moved across the gallery. Phones lifted higher. This was no longer humiliation, this was a duel, and Jasmine was winning with the very tools Howell thought she owned. Anger sparked in Howell's eyes. She accused Jasmine of misrepresenting the law, of twisting facts. It was an accusation drenched in projection, for it was Howell who had bent truth to suit her narrative. The hypocrisy was exposed in real time. And then came the avalanche of twists. Each attempt Howell made to reassert control only highlighted the fragility of her case. Each rebuke Jasmine delivered landed with greater force, not through volume but through precision. The rhythm of the exchange became a storm, Howell striking, Jasmine countering, each turn raising the stakes. The emotional whiplash was electric. For those who had believed Jasmine crushed, there was awe in her sudden resurgence. For those loyal to Howell, disbelief turned to panic. And for Jasmine herself, the anger she had carried was transmuted into triumph. Her calm voice cutting sharper than any gavel could. Outside the chamber, the clips went viral almost instantly. On TikTok, the moment she calmly dismantled Howell's precedent was replayed with captions like, "She cooked the judge with her own law." On Twitter, users declared, "That's not a congresswoman, that's a legal assassin." Memes flooded Instagram comparing Howell's gavel to a toy hammer in Jasmine's hands. The validation was overwhelming. What had begun as humiliation became vindication, a wave of public recognition that her brilliance was undeniable. Hashtags trended, commentary flipped, and suddenly the narrative was no longer of a woman silenced but of a judge exposed. But it wasn't only entertainment. Beneath the viral storm was something heavier, something ideological. People began asking what it meant when a judge, the supposed guardian of law, could be outmaneuvered by someone she had tried to humiliate. What did it say about the fragility of authority, about the resilience of truth, about who the system truly served? Jasmine felt it too. The room had transformed. This wasn't about her pride anymore. It wasn't about Howell's arrogance. The chamber had become a stage for something greater, a battle between two visions of justice. One saw authority as unchallenged command. The other saw truth as the higher law, unbending even to a gavel. The air thickened with that realization. What began as a punishment attempt had become a referendum on authority itself. The duel was no longer about one woman versus another. It was about the soul of the system. The showdown was no longer personal. It was ideological. The silence inside the chamber no longer felt like silence at all. It thrummed alive with the tension of two visions colliding. Howell stood for hierarchy, a rigid belief that order was power, that authority existed to be obeyed, not questioned. Jasmine, by contrast, radiated something far more dangerous to that old order, the calm certainty that respect cannot be commanded, only earned. When Howell struck the gavel again, demanding discipline, the sound didn't land the way it once had. It echoed hollowly, like a desperate reminder of power slipping through her fingers. Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned forward, eyes steady, and spoke with a clarity that sliced through the chamber. Law and order, she said softly, only mean something if they are tied to fairness. Strip away fairness, and all you have left is intimidation. The words hit harder than any outburst could have. Howell's face tightened. She accused Jasmine of grandstanding, of politicizing what should have been a matter of courtly respect. But the gallery had already shifted. The very people Howell expected to back her authority were now questioning it, their doubt visible in the tilt of their brows, the whispered exchanges, the phones capturing every moment. Jasmine pressed further, refusing to let the hypocrisy stand. If authority means silencing truth, she said, then what you protect is not law, it's fear, and fear has never delivered justice. The ripple effect was instantaneous. Clips of that line, posted within minutes, were already surging online. Commentators seized on it as a defining moment, comparing it to historic speeches where the underdog turned the weight of power upside down. Hashtags soared. Howell, once framed as the embodiment of iron discipline, now looked brittle, even petty, beside the younger woman's unshakable composure. Emotion swirled in waves. Awe swept through Jasmine's supporters. Awe at her precision, her courage, her refusal to bow. Shock rippled among Howell's defenders, forced to watch as the judge's composure cracked under the weight of her own contradictions. What had begun as a contest of rules had become something elemental: truth versus facade. The ideological clash was unmistakable. Howell embodied the old architecture of hierarchy. Power flows downward, obedience rises upward. Jasmine embodied the reversal: power flows outward, shared, accountable to the people it governs. Each sentence she delivered stripped Howell's authority down to its skeleton, and Howell felt it. Her rebuttals grew sharper but thinner, more desperate. She leaned harder on her robe, her title, her gavel, symbols that once commanded reverence but now rang hollow against Jasmine's unblinking clarity. The unraveling wasn't loud. It was the slow tearing sound of a curtain pulled back, exposing what lay behind. By the end of the exchange, the room no longer saw Howell as untouchable. They saw her as human, flawed, clinging to power in the face of truth she could not contain, and they saw Jasmine not as an agitator, not as an unruly voice, but as a figure of justice, precise, relentless, unwilling to let intimidation masquerade as law. The moral whiplash was complete. What began with certainty in the judge's dominance ended with certainty in Jasmine's vision. Order had crumbled into doubt, intimidation into exposure, and a courtroom confrontation into a cultural reckoning. And then came the fallout. When the gavel struck again, its weight no longer commanded the room. The sound was there, sharp and insistent, but its authority had drained away. What once silenced now only reminded everyone of how much silence had already been broken. Judge Howell looked diminished, her attempt to punish turned inside out. Not just ineffective, but humiliating. What she meant as a warning had instead become her undoing. The fallout was swift. Commentators who once praised her iron discipline now whispered about overreach. Reporters described the scene not as a display of judicial control, but as a battle lost. In the headlines, the words shifted: judge under fire, authority challenged, Crockett turns tables. Howell's image, once framed by severity and command, was now marked by cracks, the kind that spread quickly once exposed to light. But Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't stand triumphant over Howell's collapse. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet steadiness that had brought her through. When the cameras sought her face, they didn't find arrogance. They found composure. And when she finally spoke, it was not to revel in victory, but to return the focus where it belonged. "This was never about me," she said. "It was about fairness, about the belief that law should never be wielded as a weapon against those who speak truth." Her words landed with the resonance of something larger than the room, larger than the feed. She had turned the attempted punishment into a parable, arrogance collapsing under the weight of truth, power unraveling when it mistakes intimidation for respect. And yet, it wasn't bitterness she left behind, but hope. For every person who had ever felt underestimated, mocked, or silenced, Jasmine's calm defiance offered proof that brilliance and dignity could cut through even the heaviest chains of authority. She stood not as someone who had merely survived a clash, but as someone who had redefined what victory looked like. The gallery filed out with the story etched in their minds. A congresswoman, dismissed as too bold, too brash, had faced down one of Washington's most intimidating figures, and won not through anger, but through precision and truth. The air carried the weight of that shift, the quiet realization that entrenched power was not unshakable, that the robes and gavels of authority could be challenged, and that sometimes the youngest voice in the room could speak with the greatest clarity. And as the headlines spread, as the clips went viral and the commentary poured in, one question lingered. If a single exchange could shift the balance this much, what would happen when the next collision came? Because this clash may just be the beginning, Judge Beryl Howell tried to punish Jasmine Crockett, but instead, she set the stage for Jasmine's brilliance to be broadcast to the world. What was meant as discipline became revelation, and what was framed as humiliation became proof of legal genius. Online, the response was immediate and ferocious. One viral comment summed it up bluntly: "She bodied that judge without breaking a sweat." Another said, "That wasn't a courtroom moment. That was a masterclass." Millions of views poured in, and the narrative flipped. The judge looked smaller, the congresswoman stood taller, and dignity beat intimidation in full public view. But here's the real question: if you were sitting in that courtroom, whose side would you have been on? The robed authority wielding fear, or the young leader armed with truth? Was this the coldest clapback of the year, or the beginning of something even bigger? Drop your take in the comments below, because this isn't just a story, it's a movement. And if you believe arrogance will always collapse under truth, subscribe now. Join the conversation. Be part of what comes next.